There's not just one way to be a man.
It's also about including men in the conversation.
When we narrow the definition of what it is to be a man, we give fewer opportunities for men to be accepted and to be in a group.
Like, we can be a multitude of things.
There are many men who are sensitive. There are many men who are gentle. There are many men who are soft. And these things can be masculine.
My name is Abby.
And my name is Liam, and you are listening to the Evolving Love podcast.
In this podcast, we deep dive into the topics of non-monogamy and relationships, drawing from our experiences of being consensually non-monogamous for over a decade.
Whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, curious, or anything in between, we invite you to join us for this conversation. Let's begin.
Dear listener, before we jump into today's episode of the Evolving Love podcast, we have a favour to ask of you.
If you are not already following and subscribed to Evolving Love on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening to this episode, please hit that subscribe button.
It is a fantastic way to support our show and ensure that you will never miss an episode.
In today's episode, we are joined by James Winestock, and it's a cracker of a conversation. This is a topic that we have wanted to explore for a long time on the Evolving Love podcast, and we are so glad we had James to explore it with.
When we reached out to him to ask for his bio, he sent us this, which I will read verbatim. James Winestock is a lapsed historian who is now head of editorial at Inspired to Write, where he helps his wife Amy tag dialogue correctly. He's the host of the Unpublished podcast, writes fantasy novels in his spare time, and thinks Substack is the next big thing.
What James forgot to include in this bio is that he is a man who thinks deeply about what it means to be a man, and how society's relationship to masculinity is evolving. He is thoughtful, kind, sensitive, strong, intelligent, and embodies so much of what I admire in masculinity.
In today's conversation, we discuss whether men deserve a voice, sensitive men, role models, social media and the influence of the manosphere, how to bring men into the conversation, how men can advocate for men's issues and hold feminist ideals in tandem, the importance of men expressing affection, the role of a competitive nature in masculinity, why every man must own a lamp, how Liam's masculinity impacts on his metamor relationships, and Liam and I have a bust-up that is mediated by James over how Liam makes my cups of tea.
So now we bring you James Winestock. Masculinity is something that I think a lot about, and Abby and I talk about this quite a lot, and we have wanted to have a chat with the wonderful example of a man and who thinks very deeply about it, and that is you, James.
So great to be chatting, guys. Thank you for having me on the pod. Obviously been a fan from afar for a long time. Actually, remember listening to the first episode when we were in the car waiting for ribs and burgers once. And then messaging you immediately. Yeah. And we were like, so proud of you guys. And it's just been amazing to see you not only keep at it, but do such an awesome job of it.
Oh, I love that. Should we talk a little bit about the connection?
Yeah, let's do it.
It's an interesting story. You go.
Well, so I used to live in Oxford back in the day when I was much younger, and I was family friends with Amy. And so we kept in contact a little bit, but then we moved back to Australia. I moved back to Australia when I was 12. And then I reached out to Amy probably, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, because one of my students in my songwriting class at university said, I followed this amazing Instagram account called Inspired to Write. And I was like, I'll check it out. And who was it but bloody Amy McGee? And so I thought, okay, this is surely a sign that I have to reach out. I managed to stalk Amy, find her on Facebook, sent a little Facebook DM, and Amy incredibly got back to me and said, I do remember you. And then we kind of picked up from there. And then we obviously met you through Amy, which was wonderful. And we came up to Sydney and we had this amazing lunch in Sydney. And immediately we were like, this is awesome. And James is a legend.
You're showing our age a little bit there, talking about Facebook DMs, but yeah, I agree. It was very serendipitous. And also it was, I think, before, for those of you, I feel like, who don't know my wife, Amy, who is really the brains behind the operation. She is a writer and has a very popular Instagram account, which I just ride off the coattails of, called Inspired to Write, as Liam mentioned. And it actually, I feel like when you first encountered Amy was before she'd kind of hit it big as well.
Mm.
And I feel like it was a little bit more underground. You kind of got in the indie phase.
Well, I think there was probably maybe a few 100,000 followers. There was like 100,000
maybe 20.
followers.
I don't think it would have been that big by then.
I don't think so.
Oh, it wasn't
I
that
think
big?
I
Yeah.
think she blew up because as soon as I got onto Amy's Instagram, it became my like daily, and it still is. Like
Yeah.
it's been such a creative support for me.
Yeah,
reading
like
her writing.
a creative doula.
Yeah, she's like a creative doula. I feel like I read her post and I'm like, oh, thanks, Mum.
Yeah.
Just what I needed.
I think it's important that we spend the first 2 minutes talking about Amy. That's what she would want. That's what she would
Yeah,
love.
exactly.
Well, we have granted her wish.
She's a bit bummed that she isn't on the podcast today as well.
Well, we're gonna chat with you as a couple because also you have this amazing kind of creative relationship as well as obviously being married as well. So there's so much to talk about you know how one functions within a creative relationship when two creatives are together, because you are also an amazing writer. One of the pieces that you wrote recently on your Substack is really kind of the catalyst for why we're having this conversation today, because it really affected me and it was focused very much on masculinity. And I'll read the title because I feel like the title carries so much weight in it, and maybe we can jump off from there. But the title was, "No, Young Men Aren't Okay. I know because I have been there." So what made you decide to write an article like this?
Well, I think there's been a lot of discourse, I think, since the US election about this sort of wave of young men who are, you know, maybe voting more right, who are maybe disaffected and unhappy with how society is. There's a lot of talk about how men are retreating, how men are kind of becoming, for want of a better word, these sort of incels living in basements who are writing angry comments on the internet, and what we can do about that. And I guess my view was I can understand the perspective of a lot of these men because I kind of feel like I spent my mid-20s in a basement, well, in my parents' attic, playing a lot of video games. And I kind of remember what that felt like. I remember what that felt like, and it didn't feel good. So I wanted to write a piece that was both sort of hopeful and talk to my own experience being one of these sort of listless young men. And I also wanted to, I think, state that I think we kind of think of the Andrew Tate side of the toxic masculinity debate a lot. I think that's quite common, and for good reason, because it's terrifying and terrible. But I think there's almost a larger swathe of the male population that are more just sort of purposeless and disaffected. And that's sort of what, obviously, very, very worrying, the Andrew Tate stuff. But I think there are many more men who are in the purposeless camp, and being very conscious that, you know, obviously, I think it's necessary to stay up front that a lot of the discourse around how, quote unquote, bad men have it at the moment, I don't want to ignore the fact that there are many, many more serious issues that affect women at the same time as well. And of course, this sort of purposelessness that men have, I don't want it to take away at all from the fact that women, obviously, like, it's not like feminism is over, you know? It's not like, and I just wanted to obviously say that up front. And maybe it's not necessary to caveat that. I think that most of your listeners would understand that when we have a conversation about men, we're not trying to diminish at all the fact that women are still in many ways operating under patriarchy, and that's the fact that men are also struggling can live at the same time, I think is my point.
Yeah. Well, it's not a zero-sum game. You know, from us having a conversation like this, the idea is not to minimize, as you were saying. It's actually to say that there are unique issues that face men as well, and face us as we kind of grapple with our own notions of masculinity. And, you know, I'm mid-30s now, even though I still think that, like,
you still think you're 24.
I still think that I'm 24 in my mind. But I look back to, you know, growing up, I went to an all-boys school for most of my schooling, and I think that was the same for you. And I wonder, what were your initial kind of thoughts around masculinity? Was it something that as you were going through school, surrounded by a lot of testosterone, was this something that you were very aware of?
I was super aware of it. You know, I did a lot of the stereotypical male things. You know, I was in the rugby team. I occasionally hung out with the jocks. Like I feel like I was surrounded by, I had this weird thing when I was at school because I was both very interested, I was bookish, and I felt like I was a bit more sensitive, but at the same time, I was in these masculine circles. And it was just so full on for me. You could really feel the weight of that there was something to be, there was some way that you were meant to be a man. And I felt like that so strongly when I was at school, being in an all-boys school I actually was only in an all-boys school from year 7 to 9. I was in a mixed gender public school, which I loved. And then I kind of arrived in an all-boys school in year 7. And I was like, what is this? This is definitely very different. And I did not like it. I found it really stressful to be around because I feel like that whatever version of masculine culture that is, it's very loud and it's very, it takes up a lot of space, and it's very hard to be in a room with it and not think that it's somehow dominant. Because, whenever these boys were, they're making their loud jokes and they're kind of like, talking in the way that young boys do. And you kind of think, I often had the reaction of, is this really the culture that I have to be a part of? Like, do I have to engage in this culture?
Do you have to assimilate into this craziness?
Yeah, do I have to assimilate into this craziness when there are so many more interesting and enjoyable conversations I could be having? And I know it probably wasn't that deep when I was 13 years old. And it's probably more of a general vibe. And this is me narrativizing it as a 32-year-old. Certainly, I think, and as you said, Liam, it's a real thing. Like, this masculine culture that we pick up in schools is a real thing.
And we carry it with us as we go through.
We do. It's like, whenever I see a large pack of boys, like I was just thinking, I was in the gym the other day, and I really, this group of 6 high school age boys came in, and I almost had like a flashback moment where it stressed me out completely to see this pack of boys in the gym. It was like, I was back there in year 7 or 8, and I had to sort of stop for a minute, and it took me a while to actually take several days of me seeing this pack of boys in the gym for me to realize that actually something kind of sweet was happening over there, and that I didn't have to treat them as like an annoyance for taking up space in the gym, and that actually I was projecting onto them a lot of the things that I had from school. But it was like a real, I haven't escaped whatever that culture is, even as someone in their 30s. Like, it's still something that sits at the back of my mind.
Knowing who you are now, through what you share and meeting you and your beautiful writing, and you're such a thoughtful and I would say sensitive person, so considered. I just want to go back to young James and like give you a hug when I hear this, like you in the classroom, like hearing all of this boisterous, like larrikin energy, which I'm sure was there, but also like I'm sure it brought up feelings of like you'd have to join it, or then if you don't, you're then ostracized, you're alone, because it's like at our core, we want to be part of a community, we want to be part of a group, and perhaps as men, part of a pack.
Absolutely. In high school, I remember, because the weird thing about where I went to school was in year 10, girls suddenly joined the school. So you have this clash. I know, it was really weird. And you have this clash of this male culture coming up against this female culture. And I think you really felt the modern culture that you were in, right? And you really felt how you were being pressured to act a certain way, and how when it directly comes up against another culture, first of all, you realize how strange it is, but you also realize how much force there is behind it, because it can override your personality. And I think this is something that is really interesting about male culture. And I think that's a very fraught term, I guess. But the way that we raise young men is that it feels like it's the only way. And the way that we raise young men, it doesn't have to be that way. I think it's so clear that it doesn't have to be that way. And there's not just one way to be a man, but we make it men feel that there is. And that juxtaposition really, I think, was so good for us. And they often say that, there was a rival school just down the road from us, and they don't have girls the whole way. And I think they had ended up having a lot more problems. You see a lot more typical jockish behavior, like typical, frankly, a lot more unacceptable behavior from the boys in that school, because they don't get confronted when they're 14 or 15 with this idea that actually the way you're acting is, one, like not the way you have to act, and two, kind of weird.
Yeah.
And I was very grateful for the girls coming in year 10, because it made me realize that the sensitive sides of me and the side of me that didn't want to be part of this sort of masculine culture was kind of okay. And obviously I didn't accept that part of me immediately, but it definitely shone a light on the fact that it was more acceptable to be a bit more sensitive, a bit more bookish, a bit more thoughtful. It didn't have to always be engaging in these boisterous, blokey circles, Yeah.
Well, there is this sense that kind of masculinity is this monolithic kind of creature. Like, this is what a man is. This is what it looks like. That, I guess the stereotype of like an Andrew Tate standing on a mountain, lifting boulders, but the idea that there is nuance to masculinity. And this is something that I really confronted, because initially I went to school kind of in my early years in England for a lot of the time. And I moved to Australia when I was 12. So I had this, I was at a school where it was all boys, but there was like a real celebration of artistic kind of creativity. And I felt like, you could be a sports player and you could also be an artist. It was like it was a beautiful environment. But then I got to Australia, and Australian culture just felt so different. It felt so foreign to me. It was like, are you in the rugby team? Are you in the cricket team? If you're not, there's a problem. And I remember when I was saying, oh, I'm in the choir, but I was also good at cricket, which is ultimately what won me favor with all the jocks. So I was accepted into those circles, but I still did all my choir stuff, and they just kind of didn't really know what to do with me.
Absolutely, they didn't. And you're right, it's a currency. Like, being good at sport in Australia is an absolutely crazy powerful currency. And I don't know what it means and why, but if you're a boy who's good at sport, and this is what I got away with because I was good at rugby, I was sort of given permission then to read fantasy novels because, and as you said, Liam, they kind of, when I would bring it up and try and talk to them about fantasy novels, they'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, what are you talking about? But like, you kind of get a pass, whereas I really felt for the other boys who were just into fantasy novels and they weren't good at rugby. And only 15 people in the year of 250 people could be in the A rugby team. So suddenly only 15 people are allowed to also like fantasy novels, where it's clear that the maths just isn't mathing there, right? Because clearly only 15 people are good enough at rugby and maybe even interested in rugby. But we're telling all 250 that they must love rugby. And it's this, if you can somehow achieve the most status, you can then define what it means to be a man to everyone else. And most people are like, oh, that's not what it means for me to be a man, but I'm getting told. And I think, just to sort of jump ahead a little bit here, you often see a lot of masculine culture is dictated by the men who are the richest and the most powerful. And they're like, what it means to be a man is this. And then you go, well, according to you, because that's worked out very well for you. But why are you allowed to tell everyone what it means to be a man? And that it's basically being good at rugby, earning a lot of money, and, I guess just being a sort of loud, boisterous stud is the only way to be a man.
Yeah, we actually came across this binary idea of masculinity just recently. We were with some school friends of ours, another family, and we were at the river having a lovely time. And the father is really sporty, super sporty guy. And when we arrived, the mother, the wife, she said, oh, look, we almost invited you guys over to our place because the cricket's on and he really wanted to watch the cricket. But then, we thought, oh, well, like Liam wouldn't want to watch the cricket. And I was like, oh, we totally would have done that. Like, we absolutely would have gone to your house and had the cricket on. That's not a problem. Liam loves sport. And the dad was like, what? He was like, you are into sport. And Liam was like, yeah, I play heaps of sport. Like, I'm really into sport. I'm really into tennis. I'm really into hockey. I'm really into like any sport. Like, you're into sport.
Yeah.
It blew his mind. He could not believe it
because he knows us from the podcast. Like, they came to the live podcast. He knows the fact that I'm a musician. He knows that I do gigs and all this kind of stuff. So he put me in this is a creative man. He does that kind of thing. So how could he possibly be into cricket? And then it was really funny because it kind of unlocked this kind of weird competitive thing. So when we were playing cricket as a family, I was like going maybe a little bit too hard just to prove my point.
Just bowling bounces at him.
It was the perfect example of like we can be a multitude of things.
Did you also feel like your stock sort of went up in his eyes? Like, could you feel that you had more respect from him?
Yeah, well, that was the interesting thing. It's like, for him, because he doesn't have a frame of reference for creativity, and I'd love to know what you find with this, being an amazing writer, but because he didn't have a frame of reference for creativity, like, he didn't really value that within me as like a masculine trait. But then as soon as the cricket came in and as soon as we started connecting about sport, he was like, oh, okay, like, we're dads, we're going to be men, we're going to hang out, this is going to be how we connect. And I thought, oh, it's such a shame,
It's such a shame because I honestly believe that there are just as many, if not more, men who want to make art as there are who want to play cricket. I think making art is a fairly universal thing. I think that there are just there's so many people in general who want to make art, but we do classify, I think, making art as, that includes writing, and maybe unless it's very serious kind of scientific writing or something, or historical writing, we classify art as something that is not masculine. And we classify wanting to spend time doing creative pursuits as not masculine, and yet sport is. And it's just so clearly a strong cultural narrative to me because, for one thing, everyone loves to consume art. Like, I'm sure lovely man who plays cricket, maybe loves music, loves to go to the movies, probably loves to read a book every now and then, all these things that he loves to consume, but wouldn't ever give himself a chance to try to create himself because it's not considered to be masculine. And I think there are a few, I noticed in my friendship groups, a few creative pursuits that maybe are allowed to be masculine. Like woodworking is something that for some reason is allowed to be masculine, or
you have to be able to make a weapon.
Yeah, to be able to make a weapon. If you can't make a weapon, if you can't survive, if your art doesn't let you survive the apocalypse, then what are you doing? And I think there's a cultural narrative that what men do has to be functional in some way. And maybe sport is some kind of proxy for athleticism and functionality. I'm not sure exactly what my thread is there, but I think men don't know what to do with creativity because they don't think that they're allowed to be creative. And I think there's a wound there as well, because I think that there's a lot of desire in men to be creative, but they're told they can't be and they shouldn't be from a very young age.
And we actually see this kind of looping in non-monogamy. We actually see this with our non-monogamous male friends. And a lot of them would say, oh, I'm not a creative person. But, then they're in the kink scene. They're devising these amazingly creative scenarios of these, these BDSM scenarios. And they're thinking of all these incredible fantasies, or they write these amazing, messages. These men are truly creative. Like, they don't see themselves as being creatives because maybe they're a lawyer, or maybe they're a doctor, or maybe they're in the army. But it's like, to me, it's like the purest form of creativity is often expressed in these kind of sexual landscapes.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something just like sex. Creativity, I think, is innate within us. It's innate within all of us. The idea that there's a single human out there who isn't creative is bizarre to me.
When I think about creativity and masculinity, I think a lot about the performative nature of it and what, because obviously we're signaling to potential partners. So when you were single, there would have been kind of in your mind the ideal of what is going to attract a partner. And for me, like, a lot of the drive to be in particular types of music, like, I play guitar and I was a front man of a band, and that's where actually Abby and I met each other. It's like that to me signaled a kind of masculinity within the creativity. But I wonder, when you were signaling to Amy, like, what were the kind of masculine signs that you felt that you were putting out into the world?
I love this question. And I just had so many brainwaves when you talked about that. A few things. Well, Amy and I met in drama class, for starters. Okay. We were put together in the same dramatic performance. Like, I think it was a group of 3 of us, and the third girl never showed up for any rehearsals. So it was just me and Amy. And we didn't get together for ages after that, but they were sort of the first moments of Amy and I just being together. I've always made sure that my creative side, now I say I only started writing my book, in 2019, but I've always written poetry for Amy. And not like all the time, but I frequently will send Amy a poem, and it's often never about her. I'm not writing her love poetry. I'll just write a poem. I'm like, what do you think?
But it's the intention.
It's the intention. I think I've often used art to communicate with her. Like, I remember one of the first things I do, and I kind of cringe at it, but I think it's really cute, is one of the first letters I wrote to her was all my favorite Shakespeare quotes that reminded me of her.
Oh
my God, it's so beautiful.
Oh, you're the best.
The great thing about Amy is she always gave me the space to express any side of masculinity I wanted to. So, like, at the same time, she would sit and watch a Wallabies game with me, and she would come to the gym with me, even though they weren't things that really interested her at first. Like, she's kind of become a gym rat since, but it certainly wasn't interesting to her in the beginning. And she also really gave me the space to, write her, talk about Shakespeare, or write her a poem, or something I really value in a partner is that they will accept me for both those sides of myself. And I know that's something that maybe that's rare, but I certainly feel like I was able to signal to Amy that I was an attractive male through things that weren't just playing rugby and going to the gym. And I think that was really important, because if I had to only signal to someone that I was attractive because I play rugby and go to the gym, the relationship would never work. Because they would very quickly realize that there are all these other parts of my personality that are not congruous with that. And I think being able to, from the beginning, have that side of me come out so clearly to Amy was super helpful. And I think that's also why I was not interested in dating when Amy and I got together. And I think it really took someone like Amy for me to be like, actually, do you know what? I could see myself dating. I mean, she's an amazing woman. I mean, you guys know Amy. She's an amazing woman. And I think that the freedom she gives for me to express my masculinity in any way that I want And we often talk about how both of us have a masculine and a feminine energy.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, I think we were talking before the podcast about how much I believe in this idea that there is even such thing as a masculine and a feminine energy. But certainly, I think that we both embody parts of what society would say is are masculine traits and feminine traits, and in kind of roughly 50-50 arrangements as well. Like, I would love to move towards a society where those softer traits and those harder traits can kind of live together more fluidly within men and women as well, and it could be a strong signal that you're a rounded, attractive person, I think.
It makes a lot of sense to me that you and Amy met in a drama class, because it's as a former drama kid myself, I did a lot of productions and a lot of music and shows and things sort of through school and high school and uni. It's such a world of like fantasy and creativity. It's like not the normie way, you're in this like altered state. And I feel like you and Amy, with what you do and how you pursue the world and your dreams, it's like that anything is possible. It's like you've already sort of been in Narnia together. And so you can like have a life and create something together that's like magic and totally authentic to the two of you. So that just makes so much sense to me that you two met in drama class.
I agree with all those sentiments. I think it's been so important as well because Amy and I have really been able to grow together, because I think you're right. Like, the beginning of our relationship was make-believe. It was the understanding that you kind of create your own realities and you create your own... the creativity has always been at the center of our relationship, even though I repressed mine for a long time. As you said, like, it was an initial impetus for it was our drama class. So I think it's been a really key because Amy and I are very different people now at 32 than when we met at 17, but we've been able to grow together and either adapt to the other's changing personality or accept the other's changing personality, because I think you're right, like creativity allows you to do that in so many other ways.
As you were saying, we entered the kind of dating market a fair while ago. And so we did it before social media. And I feel like social media has had such a huge impact on the way in which masculinity is portrayed. And, we have the Andrew Tates, we have the Manosphere, we have all these like really intense podcasters that are portraying it. But how do you think we can make this shift towards these sensitive men being kind of celebrated for that being such a beautiful trait of masculinity as well?
It's so interesting. I kind of despair about it a little bit, because I often think if I just got really muscular, like if I just got on some testosterone and some steroids and started talking about this shit, like suddenly you'd get millions of boys who'd be interested in hearing about it, which I think is, I think that's where you get a lot of these guys. Like, they look like that. I mean, let's take Hormozy, for example. Like, he's on testosterone, and he's, I'm sorry, I don't think this is defamatory to say. I think he's openly admitted to being on testosterone. He's jacked. Like, he's super jacked. And the boys love it. I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's like, how do we... There's just some kind of like... And once again, I don't know if it's... I feel like it's a cultural thing. And maybe
like
it's
primal.
Biological. Maybe it's biological and primal, but it's like, see man, big muscle, must be cool. And I mean, part of me honestly wonders, do I just try and get as jacked as possible to talk about all this sort of stuff?
Well, I'm going to leave that to you. I don't think I'm going to go to the gym. I'm getting into bouldering, so I don't think my capacity for getting jacked. But it's funny that you bring up that as an example, because if we look at another example of, to me, in a lot of ways, a really positive example of masculinity in the podcast sphere is someone like a Theo Von. Because he kind of goes against a lot of the stereotypes of masculinity. This kind of like, you can't be fragile, you can't accept, you can't project weakness, you can't cry, and he's openly doing this within these podcast conversations. And I think someone like him maybe is, moving the needle a little bit without having to be, a jacked, Chris Williamson type.
Do you think because he has that audience as well, he's got that sort of, he does have a lot of sort of center right people, so he'd be having a bit of an impact?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's also about including men in the conversation, because it is tempting, as you were saying at the beginning of the conversation, James, is to take the Andrew Tate and this caricature of what hypermasculine energy is, and then just assume you're either that or you're just like, what the right would call like a cuck, or, like some sort of
boy.
like,
wimpy.
A soy boy. Yeah, exactly.
What's a soy boy?
I don't know. It's actually quite old, I think. I feel it's like from 7 or 8 years ago. I think it's like basically, it's a wimp.
Yeah, it's like a hypersensitive.
Yeah.
But if we can say that there's actually a middle ground of masculinity that isn't this jacked, I never cry, I project strength at all times, I win at all costs, I don't sleep, I grind 23 hours a day and then I wake up Goggins style. It's like, if we can say, actually, we are men, we cry, we're sensitive, we're creative, and we can find a way to celebrate that. And maybe that's it. Like, how do you think, Abby, how do we start that conversation from a female perspective, do you think?
Well, I feel like a lot of it comes down to your environment and, of course, your influences, but it comes back to actually, being authentic, because, when you think of like your time at school, which we haven't spoken about much, but, James sort of going into that environment, it's like our environment is like shaping us. But if you're able to sort of have these examples and be your authentic self and really seeing it in other people. And that's why I think, storytelling is so amazing and, really making the effort. I mean, I think about it a lot as the mother of a boy. I am, I'm really thinking about it so much because I want him to have these good examples of men, what I perceive to be a good example, in touch with their emotions, really considerate, caring, progressive men. But also, for my son, I'm like, I want him to also be seen and be valued as a man, be valued for the person that he is, because I think that all of us as human beings, we need to be seen and we need to be wanted and accepted and be part of a community. And I think that real danger comes when we're not actually accepted into a group. And that's when you can be alone, you're on the internet, the algorithm grabs you, and then you're gone, because you're going to be valued there in that space by these people that are, potentially they could, twist your mind more on, what I'm trying to say. So it's like,
bad actors.
But I think also saying that is like saying that I want my son to be able to have a voice, be seen, have his passion, be celebrated, be a good person, be able to be of equal with those around him. I think that also should be a totally fair thing to say. And it's a bit of a hot topic.
No, I love it. I agree with you in so many ways. I think the point is, which you said so beautifully, is when we narrow the definition of what it is to be a man, we give fewer opportunities for men to be accepted and to be in a group. And I think lonely men is a huge problem. And we want men in community. So when we say there's only one way to be a man, and then you funnel all these men into Andrew Tate, and suddenly once they get in there and they go, okay, this is what it means to be a man. They try and fit their personality into it. And it's not going to suit the majority of men. Most men aren't hyper aggressive. Most men aren't, whatever Andrew Tate is, 99% of men aren't like that. But when you try and fit yourself into that, that's when you feel alone. That's when you feel isolated. But we're not giving these men opportunities to join groups and communities that aren't like that. And I think that's the shame. That's a real shame as well. It's like, we need to stop narrowing the definition of what it means to be a man and have a much more expansive definition of what it means to be a man that includes the many, myriad interests that men have. There are many men who are sensitive. There are many men who are gentle. There are many men who are soft. And these things can be masculine.
Yeah.
These things it can be good to be those things as a man. And I think that a lot of men who are those things don't see themselves represented. They don't see that as an option. And then so they have to repress and they have to go down the hard route. And then they just become, they don't want to make friends, because why would you want to make friends in an environment that doesn't suit any of your interests or personality? And so they end up alone.
Well, a lot of these dominant masculine voices within social media, for example, they kind of mirror what you found at school when you were talking about all the boys and this kind of raucous loudness. It's like often the loudest voice, of course, everyone knows travels the fastest and with the most force on social media. So all of the sensitive men, they're just kind of, maybe waiting for their moment to speak. And all these other big, hyper masculine kind of energies, they're the ones shouting the loudest. And recently I was at a party, and in preparation for this interview, I was kind of thinking about different things and different interactions that I've had recently that would reflect on, how we view masculinity as a society. And I was talking with a good friend of mine, and we were joking about, UFC. He really loves UFC. And we were saying, we should do a podcast about, going out to restaurants and watching the UFC and rating the food. And it was just kind of this lighthearted banter. And it was overheard by a woman at the party, and who said to us, as if the world needs another podcast with two men, and immediately, even though it was a joke, it was like, we don't need your voice, and it's because you're a man. And I found that fascinating on a lot of levels. One of the levels that I found it deeply fascinating was that she was the mother of a 7-year-old who was at the party, and the 7-year-old was a boy. And I was thinking, as parents, we also have to be cognizant that we want to raise a society, and we want to raise a place where men feel like they do have a voice and feel like they're not polluting the atmosphere by sharing, their unique voice.
Absolutely. I think that, well, for starters, maybe we don't need more of a certain kind of two men talking podcast, but we probably need many more of other kinds of two men talking podcasts, right? Like, I agree that we're probably saturated in, like the bros sitting around a microphone talking about, like, I don't know, traditional bro stuff. But I think the idea of two sensitive men who are talking about food at the same time as they're talking about sport, I mean, that sounds like a great idea to sort of allow men to have a dual personality. It's like, I think if all you were going to do is talk about the UFC, then yeah, I kind of get it. But I think you're right. It's like, we need more good, positive examples of men who aren't just the traditional testosterone-laden, like aggro macho culture. Like we need many, many more of those, and we need less of the other kind. So it's like I think it's interesting. I can understand the impulse, because it's like you turn on TikTok and you see all these panels of all these bro podcasts, and you're like, yeah, forget about that. But that's like, yeah, we don't want more of that, but we do want more of the Liam style of podcast.
It wasn't even necessarily about the type of podcast that we were doing. It was more a reflection on the kind of like immediate reaction. Like, I could have said, we're going to do a podcast on chickens, and it's still like, this person still would have made the same joke. So even though we were talking about like a hypermasculine topic like UFC, it was clearly just a joke, but the reaction was, okay, I'm gonna kind of shoot it down and have this very gendered lens through which I try and make a joke that kind of plays into this, like, oh, men shouldn't have these chats. And I've also been at dinner parties where I'm maybe one of the only men at the table, and watching the way in which men are spoken about has made me feel uncomfortable. Like, that's definitely something that's happened.
Yeah. And I will say, Liam, but it's so far from your reality as well, sort of experience. And it's like, you are a safe man. You are such a considered, caring, thoughtful person who, is totally a feminist and into equality. And so I think it is jarring to you, because it's so foreign, because you actually hear that and you don't see yourself in these comments that can be made about men, because it genuinely isn't who you are. And I think that's why it can be so jarring. But I think for me as a mum with our son, sorry to just bring it back to the mum talk, but it's where my brain goes with this, in like a productive sense. I guess for me, when I hear things like that at the party, I was at that dinner with you and I clocked it. Like, I really don't sort of I don't partake in that kind of joking that's happening, or like, it's not joking, it's like the snide comments about men. But I do have that understanding of like, this really does come from a place of hurt and pain that's happened. And I understand that. I've been hurt too. But as a mother, I think for our son, he's going to get to an age where he's going to say, Mum, what's happened? Why are these comments happening? And I think it's like really making that, like, moving forward, sharing like, well, your voice is valid and beautiful, but this is like the history of it. This is sort of where it comes from, but like celebrating his worthiness and his beautiful, good qualities. But also he has that responsibility to speak up, but also he, as his little individual, as a little 6-year-old boy, in my mind hasn't, that's not him. You know what I mean? Again, hot topic.
I have had this conversation with Amy many times, which maybe I should just shut up. Maybe the world doesn't need my voice. There's enough men out there. And Amy always smacks me down by saying, James, the way that patriarchy forms and exists is by men becoming lonely, angry, and repressing their true desires. It's like the way that's how patriarchy perpetuates itself. It's like we need more positive versions of masculinity with a voice out there, because if you shy away, guess who's not going to shy away is the men that we don't necessarily want mentoring and teaching our young boys. So it's like it's actually more of your responsibility to show yourself as a positive role model to young men. And of course, men should also have female role models. That's also very important. And we should have a culture where men are happy to have women as role models. I think that is also a problem, is that we don't allow men to take cues from women. But she's just said she just won't have it when I start talking about that. You know, she's just like, James, like, okay, great. Well, see you later. And then another Andrew Tate's just going to come in and take the space that you were going to have. And then what happens? And then patriarchy gets stronger.
So true, James.
If you're enjoying this episode of the Evolving Love podcast, we invite you to follow, comment, and subscribe. Sharing the podcast with friends, family, or lovers is the best way to support the Evolving Love podcast.
If you are interested in diving deeper and accessing my premium writing archive and other exclusive content, you can sign up at evolvingloveproject.substack.com.
From certain vantage points, it can feel like the pendulum has swung so far towards one way. And when we talk about this idea of a zero-sum game, and at the top of the conversation, you saying like, because I'm saying it's important to have these conversations about masculinity, we're not trying to take away from conversations that are really important about femininity and feminism and all of the things that encompasses, is that, you know, that there needs to be an acceptance from people who are, you know, very staunch feminists who maybe are saying it's, you know, that there has been that discourse where it's like men have had so long to speak, it's time to shut up and you've got to listen to women. And that is very true in certain contexts. But I think the problem with that is men in a moderate sense, and men who might be susceptible towards leaning to more radical thoughts about masculinity and starting in that kind of funnel towards that Andrew Tate thinking, it becomes a really dangerous problem where as soon as those people are kind of deplatforming or, you know, advising men not to speak because it's time for women to speak, those men who are really susceptible to wanting that sense of community, they start to then be the ones that we start to lose.
I think that's absolutely right. I understand the argument. Like, we can't structure society so that we just pander towards insecure, angry men. I obviously that's completely true. But at the same time, it's almost like it's a public health issue kind of to I think you're right. Like, there's a pipeline where men feel undervalued, but they're also told at the same time that their only value to society is to be a valuable, productive member of it. And then they're told that they should go away. And so then they go towards voices. I'm just repeating exactly what you said, Liam. They go towards voices that tell them that everyone's wrong and that they actually are the best and they deserve to be at the top of the pile. And I think it's obviously you're right. There's a very nuanced conversation to be had here, because in many ways, it's interesting when you know, I was in preparation for this. I read Richard Reeves' very popular book of Boys and Men. And there are some very alarming statistics about young men that are going around. But as you said as well, there is also still very alarming statistics about women and young women. And you're right. Those two things don't cancel each other out. But surely we can live in a society where you can hold both at once.
Yes.
And surely you can live in a society where you're concerned about both. It's confusing to me why that's a kind of a radical thing to say nowadays as well. And I agree that it's strange that that's a radical thing to say, because you just don't want a bunch of angry young men running around. Like, I think it's just like clear that you don't want that.
No.
And I think, and certainly, and you don't want a bunch, and more than that as well, you don't want a bunch of disaffected, sad, lonely young men, because they could be doing so much good in the world and they're not. And they're stagnant and despondent.
Well, one of the articles that you wrote on Substack gives almost this wonderful roadmap to some of the things that you would suggest men to do to really embrace their masculinity. And so I'd love you to speak about a few of those. A few things that really jumped out at me was complimenting other people Can we speak a little bit about that? How do you think complimenting other people interacts with masculinity?
I think that one, when you compliment someone else, it shows security in yourself and that you're not threatened by them. And two, I think it helps to build community. And I think a real man, if I have to use that phrase, a real man is both able to give love and receive love. And it's not, and realizes that it's not a weakness to build other people up. And I think that actually realizes that building connections and building other people up is one of the key roles of not just a man, of a person in general. But I think a lot of men think that I've got to be the top and I've got to be the best. Whereas actually, it's much more important to be someone who builds relationships and builds community than to be the best.
Otherwise, it's just feeding into that scarcity mindset as well. It's like being in that abundant mindset to be able to give love to others.
Like you were saying before, having female role models and making sure to be, uplifting them as well, making sure that it's not just this gender divide of where the compliments are going, that it's really a universal kind of embrace of everyone and the positive things about them.
Of course. Yeah. It's not, you can, as a man, being able to recognize in other people, male or female, what is good about them and to say that you like it is just like, for starters, it gives you a roadmap yourself of how you want to act. I mean, I often find it's actually really hard for me to both give and receive compliments. It's something I have to actively try and think to do. But when I do it, I feel like, an example would be being in the gym and a really big guy walks in, right? And immediately you feel threatened. You're like, that guy's bigger than me. He's more athletic than me. He's stronger than me. But as soon as and I've done this a few times, like as soon as you're like, hey man, like you, like great job, like super inspiring. And suddenly that kind of like competition just evaporates and it sort of just becomes, you're like, I really just admire that person. And I would love to have that. I love their dedication and I want to be dedicated as well. I think to me, there's so many positive things about that.
I love that. I feel like that's definitely in the non-monogamous sort of metamor way of thinking as well, wouldn't you say, Liam, with partners and things
definitely.
like that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the times where it's been really interesting to examine my masculinity has come when I've been hanging out with some of Abby's partners and we've been doing activities together. Like I had this
can I just say, this means like over the years. It's not like I have so many partners
Abby's
right now.
She's got an army of lovers just waiting outside the house. I played a game of tennis with one of Abby's partners probably a few years ago. And, I love tennis and I would consider myself to be a very competitive person with myself. Like I never, having played a lot of sport, no one wants to be the dude who's like, just like a sore loser and just making everyone's like, it's going to be a fun game, especially if it's a pickup game. So we play a game of tennis, but as soon as I stepped on the tennis court, what I found fascinating was I felt this primal urge to just destroy him in tennis. I was like, you are with my partner. Like you are, you're having sex with Abby, but
spare us the details.
Oh, okay. I won't give any more details, but I was like, and then as soon as we started playing, and he also got really competitive as well.
I kind of love this.
So it wasn't a one-way thing. It was like we both amped each other up. And then he had kind of maybe overtalked how good he was at tennis. And so there was a disparity in skill levels. And, if I wasn't feeling so competitive, I would have been like, oh, I'll just kind of take my foot off the throttle a little bit just to kind of, I don't need to go full smackdown. But I was just like, no, like for some reason, this kind of masculine, competitive, primal thing came over me and I just had to destroy him at tennis, and it felt amazing.
I totally feel, I mean, I'm the same. I am super competitive in sport. Like I get much like that. Like I just want to win. And I get it. I totally get it. And it's part of myself that I actually love. And it's not something, and this is what I talk about the duality, I think, of being a man, is that you are allowed to be competitive and you are allowed to want to win. And I would never want to say that you're not allowed that side of masculinity. It's just that I think it's also important then to temper it, because I can show up. My sport of choice at the moment is touch football. And if I know the headspace I turn up in when I get too competitive, I take it too seriously, and then I end up just feeling terrible about myself, because I think only that energy can be really negative. But when I turn up and I start complimenting people on really good runs, good tries, good passes, and I start taking responsibility for when I make mistakes, then it becomes a much more positive thing, I think. It's like competitiveness tempered. And I think it's like I still have that competitiveness. When I turn up, I still always want to win. It's the least serious touch footy game you can possibly have. I still want to win. It's like you were saying, Liam. There's just something where I want to win. But it's like you have to be able to temper it, right? Like I'm sure that then you were able to have a great conversation at the end of it. And I'm sure that didn't become, I mean, I don't know I don't want to speak for you. Maybe one of you stormed off the court.
No, it was
all
lighthearted afterwards, but there was a knowing that what happened, you know?
Yeah.
But this is really funny because when I brought that up, I didn't actually think of that story. I was actually thinking about how you are in general, which I would say is just you're not competitive. And because there have been times when I have dated someone who's like quite fit or works out a lot or something, and like you will actually often be the first one to be like, oh, like like he's so fit or
I'm impressed,
something.
like you, James, I'm impressed by the dedication that it requires to get that muscular, you know?
Totally.
It
sounds like I'm into really like jacked guys or something, and I'm not. I don't have like a type.
What are you saying? You're saying Liam is jacked? Look at him. He's broad-shouldered.
He's my front man.
I'm your front man. Yeah. The bouldering's working out. Yeah.
I mean, competitiveness is something interesting because it's something I have to really work on myself on. And if any of my friends listen to this, they'll say, actually, James, like they would definitely say this is a work on for me, is I can get way too competitive. And it's something I'm very conscious of because I think I've been conditioned, particularly in sport, and I don't know what it was about culture and this is why I feel like it's cultural, because I'm not like you, Liam. I'm not competitive really in any other part of life. Like, you know, to give you an example, and this might just be a partner thing, but I prefer Amy to find success than myself. Like if Amy has a Substack out and it's doing really well, but the one I just posted is tanking, I'm way happier than her if mine was going well. Like I really, in other parts of my life, I don't care. Or like, you know, I had a really close friend in my writing group and he is getting his novel published by Tor, which is like the biggest science fiction imprint. That is like a dream of mine. I don't feel competitive about it at all. I'm like, great, that's awesome. As soon as I step on a sport field, if it's golf, if it's touch footy, whatever it is, I just some switch just flicks in my brain. And I think I reckon it must be to do. And I'm like, is it a primal drive or is it cultural? I don't know. It's probably a little bit of both, of course, like most things are. But it's something that I'm like, really is a huge work on for me because I do think that it can suck up all the energy in the room. And I think a lot of people, no one wants to play with that guy, right? Like no one wants to play with that guy who's like throwing the golf club and who's like kicking off because someone broke a rule or, you know, like no one likes that person. A lot of these, I think, urges, and that's why I talk about complimenting because these are strategies that I feel like I try and pursue to temper some of those worse instincts that I have that maybe I've been taught by culturally or live within me somewhere that I feel like it need to be tempered.
I feel that. I feel like it's definitely environmental as well. I mean, for myself, I feel like with what I do, I don't feel competitive or anything with it because it's my own writing. It's our podcast. How could we be in competition with anybody? We're talking about our own stuff. It's my own writing. It can never be in competition with somebody else because it's my story and they have their story that's unique to them. Put me at the podcast awards and all of a sudden when we were finalists and we walked into the room, which I didn't care about any of it, I was just happy to be there. I was so excited. What an honor to be a finalist. I was looking forward to meeting people, met people, beautiful. But we walked into that competition room where you sit down and they do all the announcements. And all of a sudden it was like my eyes went like green or red or whatever. And I was like, I want to win. Like I want us to, and it like flooded my body. And it was actually horrible because like we didn't win. And then I like had this disappointment, but it was like I had to like come back from that because I felt so icky afterwards. And then I was like, but this isn't what, and then I was pissed. I was like, but this isn't what any of this is about because my whole message is that we're all individuals and we shouldn't be in competition and like damn with competitions. But
yeah, I think striving for excellence and wanting to be good at something is great. And it's very admirable. And I love that. And I would never want to say to a man or to you, Abby, I would never want to say to you, oh no, you completely suppress the competitive side of you. And I think it's just, there are almost hacks and tools that you can use to make it more of a positive experience, right? And I think that complimenting people is one of those. And I think that and also fostering, as you were saying, I've said many times throughout the conversation, Abby, like reminding yourself that it's not a zero-sum game and that, you can all benefit from it and that the pie continues to grow and someone else's success isn't at your detriment or isn't direct. I mean, maybe it is directly in the moment, but in the long run, it doesn't have to be, not that they're taking something away from you. Yeah, it's a blip.
When I think back to the kind of early stages of my life, I never really had a concept of what a man is. And maybe that was a question of role models, or maybe that was a question of just it not being a conversation. I feel like within the last, I don't know, decade or 2 decades, it's really it's the conversation around this concept of what is masculinity has just become so present. And I wonder, when you were growing up, did you have any like role models of masculinity, or did you have a notion of what it is to be a man when you were much younger?
I mean, I have a very strong father figure. My dad is a very strong personality, and in many ways embodies many very positive characteristics of what it is to be a man. He's highly competent. He is very intelligent. He also is multifaceted. Like, he always enjoyed, for example, he's a businessman, but he also has his master's in philosophy of science and quantum physics. Like, he's got many interests, and I think Dad wouldn't mind me talking about this. We probably never had very rarely would have had a very strongly emotive or emotional conversation. In many ways, he was a great role model, but in many other ways, in terms of, I wasn't able to find. I got many things from my father that I'm very grateful for, and I think he's an amazing man. But the emotional side was never our strong suit. So, I mean, that was a challenge for us, and I think no father's ever going to be a perfect father figure, right? Like, you can't criticize. And also, it was the environment that he was raised in. Those conversations are uncomfortable. It's not like I was seeing all of my my other friends' dads. It's not like they were super emotional. I think it was maybe a generational thing.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want to force him to be that. I mean, I think it's great when fathers can do that, but to force him to do that would be to force him to be someone that he wasn't raised to be. I think in terms of direct, I had some sports coaches that were really good for me, which is why I think sport can be really positive. I had some terrible sports coaches which were really bad for me as well, and bad role models. Similarly, in teachers, it's so funny. You get so many. All you can do when you're a child is learn by watching, right? You get presented with you see so many men in your life, and you kind of just absorb this milieu by observing them. Like, kids are so responsive, and so they absorb so much, right? It's just like, I think this is where the cultural side of masculinity comes in. Like, you're obviously absorbing from a very young age what it means to be a man, and the way that the men around you are portraying that is, there's obviously like a type, or there's obviously an ideal that a lot of men are sort of made to strive for, I think, which gets presented to you in many ways, which is why I think one of my points in the article was read more fiction. Men should read fiction. And I think for me, a way that I kind of got that more emotional side was through books. I'd read books written by men and women. I think that's really important. I think a lot of men are only willing to read books written by men. I think it's really important to read books written by women. And you get these myriad examples of different kinds of men who have many different personalities. And I think it seems weird, but I absorbed, I think, a lot of my information about other ways of being a man through books. I mean, even something as basic as, Aragorn in Lord of the Rings. That was such a different kind of man that we're often exposed to in our everyday life. Like, he was sensitive, and he was
hot
gentle,
in the movie.
but he was hot, and he was a warrior, and like, it's sort of that. There's that famous quote. It's you're better off being a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. I feel like he kind of embodied that, right? It's like, he was sensitive. You could see him in the garden. He probably wanted to be in the garden, right?
Right.
But he was sort of made to be this fighting man, but you could tell that he really had the soul of a poet. And I think that's just one example of what I think books did for me in terms of helping me to form my own identity as a man.
Hearing you share about your dad like that made me think of your point, number 15, send a friend a voice note saying that you love them. And I just think that is so beautiful. And it also makes me think back to an Instagram account that I was on recently, She Is Not Your Rehab. And there were videos of men calling their male friends just to say, hey, I love you. And the response from the friends was concern. It wasn't, I love you too. It was, oh my God, what's wrong?
Yeah, often, yeah.
Often. And it was such a difference because I feel like women tend to do that quite often. We send each other little messages or little voice memos, I love you. And I think normalizing this, like really bringing this to the forefront, that this should be a normal thing to tell your friends, to tell people in your life that you love them is so important to feel worthy. We come back to, about being seen and being loved and being accepted. When I read that your point was that I just thought that was so beautiful and powerful, because I'd seen this other thing on Instagram where men were doing that, but also the concern that it's just not happening enough.
This is, I mean, you might kind of pick up that a lot of the list I wrote were work-ons for me, and this is something that I don't do enough of. But the reason that I was inspired to write that was because I have a group of friends I've met as an older adult, friends I've met in my late 20s, early 30s. Actually, we all met through Dungeons and Dragons, and we send a video to the group chat on Wednesdays, and it can only be 2 minutes, where we update them on their life, and at the end, love you boys. And
beautiful.
It's very casual, but it's like, I think it's been very healing for me, and it's been very, just to make that more of just a regular thing, like to tell the men in my life that I love them. And you're right, like at first I think we all found it really uncomfortable, but you kind of grow into it, right? And I think it's like, just because we haven't been modeled that, and we haven't been told that that's okay, but the more you do it, and there are other friends that I wish I did it to more, who I don't do it to, who I don't say I love you to, and family members as well. And I think that's a real shame, because I think that the more you can do it, it really does it's so vulnerable, and it feels so, for me as a man, it's so hard and so vulnerable. Like the words feel awkward coming out of your mouth.
Yeah.
The words feel painful coming out of your mouth. But the more you do it, the better it feels and the less awkward it feels.
I think it also relates to how someone receives those words as well. Because if you are to express to your friends, I love you, and they are to receive that with like kind of awkwardness or weirdness, that immediately creates a scenario where expressing that again it just feels more and more uncomfortable. And of course, like you were saying, like, if you're all sharing it with each other, probably in a video message, it probably does feel a little bit awkward. But like also normalizing being able to say it in person as well. That's like another level of a potential awkwardness that can come. Like I definitely have men in my life who I say I love you to, but I definitely feel a similar thing to how you feel, that it can feel awkward, and it's really because I haven't seen role models of that growing up. But recently I was at my son's school, and I saw there must have been two 15-year-old boys. And one of the boys, they were just kind of like in passing, they'd both parked their bikes, and I told you about this. And he just kind of almost flippantly, just to say goodbye to his friend, said, "Oh, I love you, mate." And it was like, oh my goodness, this is incredible.
Yeah.
Especially going to a school, an all-boys school, where in my whole year, no one was out as gay. Like there was 200 guys in my year, and as far as I knew, there was no gay men. And of course now, like having kept in touch with, like there's so many. But it's crazy that because there wasn't an example within that environment, which in a lot of ways was very toxic, is that people didn't feel comfortable. But if we had been going around like these beautiful boys at school recently saying, "Hey, love you, mate," or like, "I love you, man," like, it would have just, I think it would have changed so much.
When I was in school and we're talking about saying I love you to other boys, it was such a homophobic culture when I was in school. And it was obviously incredibly, incredibly damaging to the gay boys who were in school, many of whom are my friends now. And I know for a fact that it was damaging to them because they've told me about how horrible it was. But also for the straight boys to a lesser extent, or to the boys who maybe never felt comfortable exploring their sexuality, it just made us, the idea that if you said something soft or if you said something gentle, that it was gay and that was derogatory. It's just such a simple thing, but it's just such a strong message to boys to shut up. And if you try and act outside of the norm, we're going to basically just label you as part of the out group. And I think that it's so damaging across the board to have I think that's one of the probably minor reasons that homophobia is so damaging, but it's certainly one of the reasons that homophobia is so damaging, because it doesn't allow men to express themselves how they really want to be, because many straight men want to be soft and want to be gentle, and many gay men want to be stoic and strong and like there's no.
Yeah.
It's sort of just once again categorizing us and narrowing the categories of what's acceptable can only be damaging.
When I look back at my school environment, and as we've been saying in this conversation, we are kind of products of the environment in which we grow up in. And maybe the ways in which we're talking about masculinity, if you went to Africa and had this conversation with African men, or if you were in China and had this conversation with Chinese men, they might have different cultural inputs that have really shaped the way. But when I was reading your article, actually, one thing that was there were some very funny suggestions, and I am conscious of your time, so we're getting, I guess.
No, I got time.
Oh, great. Okay, we'll keep talking till tomorrow then. But one of the things that you said was you suggested that men should buy lamps.
Which is hilarious because I went off at Liam last night because Liam was reading The Atlantic at like midnight with the overhead white light on in the other room.
That is psychotic.
Right? Yeah. It's psychotic. I walked into the room and I was like, I can't. And I just said to him, I cannot believe that you're reading under that light. I was like offended. And then there wasn't the lamp because we've been rejigging everything. Okay. I went and got you the lamp, but you were just like, it's fine. It's not a big deal.
Okay. In my defense,
there's no atmosphere. It's like, how can you even breathe? How can you even have your eyes open with that horrible light?
In my defense, it was a great article. It was very late. I'd already edited a podcast episode. I'd send you some messages about this episode, and I was already thinking about that. And it was funny because your lamp comment was in my mind, but I made the conscious decision to have this bright overhead light because it was going to keep me awake longer so I could get through the article. It was a functional choice. It was not a vibe choice.
I've raised with a lot of my male friends the fact that they don't have a lamp, but they only have the big light. And they are like, what? What are you talking about? I'm like, this is things that I have it in there. Obviously, it was a joke, but I'm serious about it. Like, people don't realize how much sexier, how much more comfortable having a lamp is than the big light. Like, put it this way, Abby, if you went back to a guy's house and he only had a big light, do you think that makes it more likely or less likely that you're going to have sex?
That's not an option.
Yeah, come on.
Absolutely not an option. Like, we're not compatible. Like, I know that immediately. We've got nothing in common. Yeah. Doesn't have a lamp.
Well, maybe I
got to have atmosphere.
Maybe I
will get up and turn a light off, even if it's like there's a big light on and it's like around the corner. Like, if the big light is on where we're meant to be intimate, there's no intimacy. It's done. But even if there's a big light on around the corner and I can feel its rays, I will get up and turn it off. I've done that before a number of times.
Maybe Liam was just really signaling to you that he really didn't want to have sex. He was like, Abby, I'm just letting you know non-verbally that we're definitely not having sex tonight. Yeah, it's contraception.
Yeah. Look, I was really enjoying the Atlantic article, I must admit. So this could have been, I mean, you definitely could have coaxed me out of the article, but yeah, maybe that was subconsciously what I was doing. I was just kind of putting up the walls.
Amy will literally never let me forget one night where I was reading a book, I was really into it, and she tried to initiate sex, and I was like, "Oh, I'm so I just, it's the climax." And she's like, "Well, I guess someone won't be climaxing." Yeah, she never let me forget the time I favored a book over her.
Has that been only once?
I'm sure it's probably happened subconsciously in other moments, but I think that's probably the only time I've genuinely refused sex to read a book.
Good book.
What was the book? Can you remember?
You know what? I don't even think it was fiction. I think it was something historical. I just had it in my head. I was like, I have to finish the book tonight, and I knew I only had limited time. But I think that the big light thing, I think that using the small light, and I have several other points on the list there, and using the small light, I think, is a signal to other people that you care about their needs as well. I think it's like having only a big light is saying that there's one kind of aggressive lighting in this house, and I will be submitting you all to it. And I won't be talking about you. And I think a lot about being a man for me is being thoughtful and trying to understand other people's needs. And that's a lot about being a person, but I think it's an aspect of masculinity that gets ignored. And often people think about masculinity as how can I have my will be the way that we go? And I think that is not, to me, what masculinity means.
The lamp is warmth and comfort.
Yeah, it symbolizes something. It symbolizes warmth, comfort. It symbolizes that you want to create a welcoming, soft environment, I think.
So does this also tie into your suggestion to drink more tea?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing inherently about tea that I think is masculine, but I also think that, like, tea is great. I love tea. I mean, I used to work in tea too, in the tea shop. Tea has always been a big part of my life. I think that making a cup of tea for someone, making a pot of tea for someone is a real sign that you value them and that you love them. And I think that I think that something that Amy and I do for each other all the time is we alternate who's making the tea. And it's a small thing, but I think to make a cup of tea for someone, it could be a cup of coffee, it could be whatever, but I just feel like it's a really, I don't know, once again, it's a signal that you care about someone, that you love them, and that you're willing to do something for them. And tea is just sort of like, tea's chill. Tea's great. So many different varieties of tea. I remember when I worked at T2, I had to know by heart the ingredients for like 152 different kinds of tea.
I think Abby just fell in love with you, James.
Yeah,
This is a sore spot.
This is actually, we don't have many arguments. Like, we don't have many fights, but the tea is I would say, is our squabble.
Can I defend myself first before you get into
No,
the
Liam, you
smackdown?
can't.
Okay. Go on, Abby.
My parents are tea people, and they are always making each other a cup of tea. It's like the love language. It's what they do. It's their way of showing that they care. And you always come back to that tea. It's like, no matter what's happened, we have a cup of tea. Like, that's just the way that I was raised with the tea. So tea is like very important for me, and it's a love language. It's like, I'll always make the tea. It's what we do. Make Liam the tea. And I've always been the tea maker. And you don't really, there was a long time where you didn't sort of make the tea.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's sort of been this ongoing thing, where
Okay.
I've sort of said, oh, it would be nice if you would make a cup of tea. But then the issue,
Thanks, James.
but then the thing, okay, so I'd love your opinion on this, James, because we've discussed this with a few people, not many. So I'm not like a fancy tea drinker or anything. I'm like pretty straight up. Bushels extra strong with soy milk. But I love, it's like, it's got to be sort of dunked in the right way, and then you squeeze the bag out of the water.
Of course.
And then it's got to be like, of course. And then you have to like put just that right amount of milk in. And Liam, bless him, you will get on the tea. You will get, like, you have, you are more conscious of like trying to, making me a cup of tea, but you make it in sort of your way to make me the tea, which is a beautiful gesture. But now it's really awkward because I will.
This is what people at couples therapy feel
because
like.
I will then
How does that make you feel, Abby?
Because, well, this is the thing. So then I've
never
sort of
bit my tongue harder right now.
said to Liam, oh, actually, I kind of like it in this way, but like you then feel it's like hurtful to you because you're like in the process of like making me this beautiful tea because you're making it your way for me. So, but then I feel like I'm not being fully seen because you're not making it the way that I like it. And there's this part of me that's like, well, we've been together for so long. You should know how I like the tea. Don't get me wrong. He's the most amazing partner, husband, of course. This is a champagne problem, I know. But it's like the symbolism of it. But I'm just wondering, it's like,
Don't throw this out to James. I get a right of reply first. I've got to have a right of reply.
I kind of want James to answer me before, and then you reply, and then he'll answer to you. I'm just interested. So I want to know if it's unreasonable of me to feel. Obviously, I can feel what I want to feel, but I get a little bit sensitive when Liam's a little bit. You don't want to make it your way. I mean, you don't want to make it my way because you like to make it your way, and you don't sort of like the feedback for me to say how I. Do you know what I mean? Like it becomes an issue about that. It's sort of like I'm ungrateful. I should be thankful, but then it's sort of like the symbolism. I don't know. It's just this ongoing thing. It's like forever.
Here's my opinion. And it's because I would say in the relationship, I'm more of the Abby and Amy's more of the Liam. And across the board, in terms of, I don't agree with the way she packs the dishwasher, for example. I don't agree with, she's she's more slapdash. It's just like, Amy's just going to do it the Amy way. And then I will be like, well, if you squeeze the tea bag, it tastes stronger. No, Amy doesn't care. Like, she's not going to care. And I think that, obviously, I understand that. I think I read into that sometimes too much. And I'm like, well, it means that she doesn't care about me. She doesn't respect my opinions. She doesn't respect me as a person. Like, she doesn't respect that when I unpack the dishwasher, that her way of packing it's going to mean that I have to rewash a lot of the cutlery. And then I have to also make sure that, all these things that you start to build this story, which I understand because I start to build that story a lot myself. But I do think that often it's more of a clash of slapdash versus structured. And I think that's maybe these sort of personalities just attract each other in some way. Like I'm attracted. I'm also very attracted to Amy's more chaotic nature at the same time. But in the moment, sometimes it annoys me. But I get, Abby, your perspective. In the ideal world, Amy would make my tea exactly the way I want it to be made. She wouldn't come in there, pour the water in, and then Amy, as quickly as is possible, she will remove the tea bag. As soon as it's like reasonably resembles a brown color. And it's not just water anymore. I die. And I'm like, whoa. But, she's I've accepted this. Like, this is just an aspect of Amy that it's not going to change.
Exactly.
And I'm at peace with it now.
For sure.
As Dan Savage would say, it's the price of admission.
The price of admission.
Okay, I have never bit my tongue harder for the last few minutes. Okay, because there's a lot of things that I would love to talk about. There's a few different things happening. One is the frequency of the teas made. So I would like to defend myself in saying that, first of all, in our relationship, I would never make teas. Like, I definitely, in terms of role models, I came from a house that never drank tea. I didn't understand the ritual of it. I think the ritual is really beautiful. And like Abby was saying with her parents, I think it's a beautiful thing to kind of return to come back to, in the same way that going for a walk every night would be a similar type of thing. I think that is a really great anchor within relationships. And it's definitely something that I have consciously had to work on. Like, there's like, in terms of like making you coffees in the morning, that comes to me very naturally. But then the tea thing, because it's out of my consciousness, like I'm not coming home and thinking, do you know what? I just love a tea. But I do believe that I'm getting better at it.
And you love tea because I make you tea and you love it. You're always like, I love a tea.
Okay, so now we get onto the next part, which is how I make the tea. Okay, now the issue is not my lack of paying attention to the strength of the tea. It's actually the way in which the strength is made. Because Abby has a very particular thing, and we got into a big argument because I was squeezing the tea bag, and I would dunk it like a million times, do the squeeze, and Abby was really upset because I was squeezing the tea bag underneath the water, and Abby has a particular way.
Thanks, James.
So James knows what's up. He's shaking his head. He's shaking his head.
Yeah.
But my thing was the efficacy of the tea is still going to be, I'm sure there's as much tea, surely, within the tea. And so it became this big thing. And then it actually became, if we really want to get into the narrative of it all, it was that I would go out and then make a tea, and I'd feel like I'm trying to show you my love by making you this tea. But then the first thing you say is the tea's not good enough. And then I was like, okay, sure.
I've never said it's not good enough. I'd say, would you like me to show you again how I like my tea?
Yeah, and once that
happens,
what
you heard is that.
And once that happens, many, many, many times, it becomes a situation where I was Googling, like I was showing Abby, like, look, the way I make tea is literally in YouTube videos by like, some tea company that I can't recall.
It's not how they want it. But I've showed you don't. It's like you don't want to watch it my way or something.
No, it's not that, but it's like it goes against my natural instinct of how to make a tea. So I have to reprogram myself, and I find it really difficult. Again, maybe because it's like that chaotic nature. But yeah, so all of that to say is that I'm trying to get better at making tea, and also trying to make sure that I make it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
I think that as someone who's worked in a tea shop, someone who came from a tea family, there are many ways to make tea, and I acknowledge there are many ways to make tea, and it does come down to personal preference. That being said, the way that Amy makes tea is wrong, so I understand that as well.
I love you, James.
What a beautiful discussion to have. I mean, this is the thing with all of your notes about from your article, Man Up, is that when you look at them kind of briefly, and when you see the lamp thing or you see the tea comment, it really, once you really burrow down into it, it just says so much. And even that tea conversation, it speaks a lot to care. It speaks a lot to love languages. It speaks a lot to being able to resolve conflict, just like the dishwasher argument. There's conflict around that. And often in relationships, like we have, lots of non-monogamous connections, and it's very rare that we will have arguments about other relationships that we have. What the real arguments that we have about
The tea.
is the tea. Or is like, I left the door open and the flies have come in and I go, well, that's fine. They're just flies. We live in Australia. Like, it's all good. But like, the then we construct, as you said, like these narratives around, well, if you don't close the door, then you don't care about my feelings. And then I have to acknowledge that, of course, like, there's truth to that. But my ability to reprogram my ability to shut the door every time is difficult for me.
Yeah, and I think that going back, to the masculine nature of things, I think it's like what I want in the list to show is that as men, because we have this strong cultural force telling us that we need to be individualistic and we need to not care about the people, that it's useful to have these small little habits that just remind you that it is actually really good and useful to be helpful, and it's really good and useful to be considerate, and that it's can be a masculine thing to care for other people and to be a carer. And there's nothing wrong with those things. And as you say, Liam, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you don't do these things that you aren't caring, but it's just like little ways to remind other people and remind ourselves and to show up as the sort of man that we want to be and to show that we're a caring person.
What a beautiful note to end it on. James, you are a wonderful example of masculinity, and I aspire to your tea-making prowess. I hope to share a tea with you soon when you're back in Australia or maybe over in England. But yeah, thanks for having this conversation because, it's when I think of all of the men in my life, I think you so beautifully are able to articulate your thoughts about masculinity. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation today. And I think listeners to this episode, whilst it's not centered around non-monogamous concepts necessarily, I think it's centered around human concepts and about, pushing things forward in a positive direction.
Thanks so much for giving me the space to talk about it. It's I think it's a really tricky topic because there's so many factors that hit it from so many different angles, and it's hard to be considerate to everyone. And as I said, being considerate I feel like is important to me as a man. But it's thanks for giving me the space to be considerate about it and to be nuanced about it and to have a conversation that I've really enjoyed.
Well, we really value your voice, and I'm really looking forward to sharing this podcast episode with our son one day. I can't wait for him to hear it.
Thanks so much, guys.
I love you.
We love you.
Love you too.
Thanks for tuning in to the Evolving Love podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback and support fuels our passion, and together we're building a community of curiosity, kindness, and growth.
Subscribe, comment, and let's keep the conversation going.